before native will come on in. You know,
All right, sounds good. Yeah, thank you everybody for coming out today. Yeah, my name is Callie Klatt Golba. I'm the curator of turtle conservation at the Peggy Notebaert Nature Museum of the Chicago Academy of Sciences. So I've been there for about a year and a half, but I've been studying these Blanding's turtles since 2014 in Illinois. And this talk I think will probably be a little bit different than Dan Thompson's and Bill Grazer's, where I'm trying to take a little bit broader perspective, but I've worked with all of them before. And everything you hear about today is the result of working with a ton of different dedicated organizations and technicians and biologists and just a lot of people. So all of this work is done not just from me, but from lots of people over a really long time span. But today I want to talk about how studying wetland wildlife, especially even at the individual level, can teach us about wetland health and how we can use that to better further our conservation. So I'm just going to step back for a second and kind of tell you why I was motivated to do this work and continue to do this type of work. So I grew up in the Midwest in Illinois, and I was always outside catching frogs and toads and snakes and turtles. And I just fell in love with the ecosystems and all the cool things that you could find there. And as I now have children and I'm able to explore nature with them and see how excited they get when they see some of these creatures, even a worm, that kind of inspires me to make sure that these really wonderful landscapes that we have in the Midwest are maintained for the future generations. And because of that's kind of a very, very big thing to do, a very hard task to conserve ecosystems forever. So today I want to talk a little bit about how we can do that and maybe a different perspective on how we approach conservation that's going to impact the most amount of species. And we're going to start with meeting a Blanding's turtle, one individual Blanding's turtle. This is Viola. And she inspired a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today. Elisa's probably met Viola before. She is kind of, we're going to hear about her story, and it's going to weave into the science today. So first, a little bit of background. So Blanding's turtles are state endangered in Illinois and internationally, and they are these really neat semi-aquatic turtles. So semi-aquatic turtles means they're not just like a painted turtle that spends all of their time in a permanent body of water, just leaving to go lay their eggs. These turtles are exploring wetlands, going in between them throughout the year. They use permanent bodies of water as well as those ephemeral bodies of water and all the surrounding uplands. So they require these really large expanses of almost mosaic-like habitat patches to complete their life cycle. And their life cycle is kind of consists of a few distinct stages. So we have the eggs, and then it takes a baby turtle 14 to 20 years to reach sexual maturity. So there's a really long time that they have to survive in order to start contributing back into the population. And then once they reach sexual maturity, these turtles will live a really long time, up to 90, 95 years old, and they will reproduce every single year until they die. So all of Blanding's turtle populations are really reliant on that adult survival and that age class. So this also really complicates conservation of these turtles because we need to protect all these different life stages that are using different habitats and are on the landscape for this really long time. So we're going to look at a few different sites today, but we're going to start with Viola's site. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the history of her site. So once the Blanding's turtle became endangered in Illinois, there was a big effort to figure out where there's still remaining populations within habitats that would be able to support a self-sustaining population. And Viola's population was one of those particular populations. It's in Lake County, Illinois, it was identified as a site that had somewhat high quality wetlands and was large enough to sustain a population. And when the Illinois Natural History Survey started studying this site, they found they wanted to figure out what is the population status. Are the Blandings turtles still there? Are they declining or are they stable? And what are those site-specific threats at this place? And oops, wrong way. I guess I can go this way. So in 2004, the sixth turtle that was captured was Viola. And this group kind of took a different approach than a lot of other scientists, where they decided that they were going to name their turtles after things that they loved in order to make it a more fun experience and kind of sustain this long-term effort. And Viola was already a large female. She was over 1,000 grams at this point and was probably around 29 years old at least. So after this initial study, they realized that this population of Blandings turtles was declining and the wetland habitat was actively becoming more and more degraded over time. So they're even seeing large pieces of trash that they had to pull out that were impacting turtles. So because of this, they started really intensive wetland habitat restoration, and they started other strategies for Blandings turtles like head starting, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. Then in 2015, this is when I came on the scene. So Viola was already being tracked for 10 years to get some of that really specific information about how long turtles live, what habitats they're using, how many eggs they lay, all those sorts of things. And once I met her, I immediately fell in love because she was this huge turtle, the biggest female in this population, but was a very shy turtle. And if any of you have worked with turtles before, as in other species as well, but these guys have very distinct personalities. So she was a very interesting turtle. And so then once we started working with her, I realized that I wanted to dedicate my career to figuring out what conservation strategies are going to work for these turtles and how do we apply that to other populations and not just Violas. So Blandings turtles, they do use all different habitats, but they're particularly reliant on these healthy wetland habitats. In Illinois, we've lost 90%, probably more, of these wetlands to agriculture and development. And then the remaining wetland habitats are often in these small patches and are starting to become degraded. So they really are in need of prioritization for restoration and protection. And wetlands are a particularly cool habitat because they're kind of this connection between the truly terrestrial areas and the permanent bodies of water. And because of this, they have all these different ecosystem benefits like flood control or cleaning water. But because they're this ephemeral area with different habitat structures, it also supports really high biodiversity. So in wetlands, these unique abiotic conditions and this very interesting complex structure that changes seasonally provides a lot of niches to create this really complex food web that supports a lot of habitat specialist species. So like some of the ones that are here. And within wetlands, we have this group of species that are wetland dependent that rely on wetlands to complete their life cycle. And some of these species are very sensitive to habitat degradation. So we call these indicator species. And that means if you see this population or these species going locally extirpated, that they're that kind of canary in the coal mine. They're telling you that there's something going wrong with this habitat and it's becoming unsuitable for life. So studying these particular species that live that have these shorter generation times, knowing if they're at a site or not can tell us how healthy that site actually is. And a different type of indicator species is an umbrella species. So these are species that rely on these really healthy habitats, but they also use really large areas of habitats. So when we conserve habitats for these umbrella species, then we're going to inadvertently preserve all these wonderful habitats for other species, including these wetland-dependent indicator species. And Blanding's turtles, because they use these really large home ranges with all of these different habitat types, they are a really good candidate for being an umbrella species. And we can't see, as in these indicator species that disappear within a year. With Blanding's turtles, we don't see that. Because of their longevity, they can hold on for a little bit longer, but we can look at other clues to figure out what's going on with them and what they can tell us about ecosystem health. So I had a few research questions that I wanted to look into, but basically trying to figure out if the creatures that we are catching at different sites reflect differences in habitat management and the surrounding area human disturbance. So the first thing that I wanted to ask was whether all of these indicator species, if we saw the presence and absence between sites, is there going to be a difference if one site has a lot of restoration versus another? And then I wanted to know if we could see the difference between sites with Blanding's turtle specifically. And like I said, since they can kind of hold on for a little bit longer, I wanted to see if things like the population age structure would reflect these differences, or if adult female health and reproductive ecology could do the same thing. And then overall, I wanted to use this to figure out how can we use what these animals are telling us to make conservation decisions that are going to conserve the greatest amount of species. So we already talked about Viola's population, so her high quality wetland. But I'm going to compare that to two other sites in Lake County, that all three of these sites have a large core wetland and have very large protected area as well. And they all have a known Blanding's turtle population. However, they differ in the amount of wetland and upland restoration efforts and the surrounding area with human disturbance. So our first site, and just to note, this isn't the actual picture of the site, this is just representing what a suburban site might look like. So our first site, which has the most amount of disturbance and the least amount of restoration, this site is in the middle of a suburban landscape, so a lot of different types of disturbance, high road density surrounding it. And although it has the Blanding's turtle population, since 2015, there has not been any restoration focused on this area. And then Viola's wetland, it has a moderate amount of human disturbance, so a few roads, a few industrial areas, but not as much as that suburban area. And they have very, very active habitat restoration for wetlands there. And at this site, there's also been a history of head starting for turtles. And the last site we'll look at is a site that's right next to this high quality wetland, but has had no turtle projects. And it also doesn't focus its restoration just on those wetlands. It just kind of takes a more landscape approach to restoration. So trying to conserve things for many different habitat types. So how do we actually catch these animals to figure out who's there and get this long-term data? So we use these aquatic traps. You can see some of them there. And you can see Elise holding that one there. And we bait them and then we set them out for the night. And each day we come back and we can check what's in there. So it's a non-lethal way to sample wildlife. And for many species, we're just recording the species and the number, but for turtles, we take a little bit more information. So with those indicator species or any of the other animals that we catch, we're going to record the actual species and the number of individuals, and that could just give us a presence absence over time of these species at different sites. with the turtles, we're doing a long-term capture mark recapture. So that means that each individual is uniquely marked. And when we catch them, we're taking a ton of different other information to create a capture history. So we're going to figure out what is their age, their sex, reproductive status, health, and some turtles will track to get a little bit more fine scale information about movement. But this creates for each individual turtle a capture history. So we can see how they're growing over time. We can see how they're maturing, how long they live, and all those fun different things that are more than just are they there or not. And it can give us, we get these individual capture histories, but if we put them all together, that's how we can start estimating things like basic demography for this species, their ecology and their health, and compare those things between different sites. So because this requires such intensive work and field work and data collection, we created this basically a BioBlitz competition that we do every year to really increase our capture and try to get every single turtle out there. And it's called the Blandings Bowl. So this is where we get usually, I don't know, 10 to 25 people out catching turtles for 1 week. And we can really get a huge sample of what's going on and increase our ability to estimate these different things and compare populations. And our main character comes back in 2015 at the end of my first season getting to know Viola. She went missing. We found her transmitter in her favorite little wetland, but she was gone. So we feared the worst. We thought she probably passed on, and she was already so many people's favorite. But one of the benefits of these BioBlitzes is that with all those people out there, we can usually find these animals again, especially if we know where they live. So she was a bonus turtle this year, where if she was caught, you got 60 points. And it really incentivizes getting those pieces of information that are especially important for our research for conservation. And our fearless leader, Gary Glowacki from the Lake County Forest Preserve District, he had been tracking her for almost that 10 years and knew where to look and saw a yellow chin peeking out and jumped in and was able to find Viola. She was okay. And we were able to continue tracking this really awesome turtle that so many people had already fallen in love with. And each one of these captures for these turtles, this is kind of what it looks like for each individual. So this is Viola's turtle profile here. And each one of these dots represents a time when we found her. And if you zoom in a little more, because that's a lot of dots, each individual dot gives us all that really specific information about when she was found, all of her measurements, her reproductive status, where she is, how many eggs she's laid, all those types of things that start creating that information that we can learn more about these populations. So we're getting this really fine scale information.
On that last slide, what's the distance on the slide? We're talking miles or hundreds of feet or?
The one on the left, I think it's probably about a mile from top to bottom.
Okay.
There, I think it's probably 600 meters across. Yep. So now we're going to forget about Blandings for a second and go back to our indicator species results. So answering that very first question was, can we see the differences in habitat management and surrounding land use area in these indicator species at these Blandings turtle sites? So we're going to look at that between those first two sites. So the suburban site that was no restoration, lots of disturbance, and then Viola's site. And here we're looking at the number of species caught in 1 year, and by different groups of species. And then in the blue, or kind of not blue, the darker color is the high quality wetland, and the gray is the suburban wetland. So before I tell you what I see, I'll let you guys look at it and see what you notice. And if anyone wants to speak up and tell me what they see.
It's way worse than suburban wetland except the turbine.
Good job. You passed. So yeah, we are seeing this really big difference in just number of species between these two sites. With the high quality population or the high quality preserve having twice as many species of these indicator species. Whoops.
A little elevator.
Well, I can tell you what so the next thing that we wanted to look at was what is the actual species composition and how does that tell us about what specifically is going wrong with these populations? So at both sites of those 20 or 10 species, we had a lot of these generalist resilient species at both sites. So we're talking like bullfrogs, green frogs, white river crayfish that can kind of survive in most places, green sunfish, black bullheads, things like that, that are not very sensitive to any any disturbances. And then we can wait a second. I guess this next one's not important to see the pictures. So the other things that we found that we were looking at were invasive species. So these are species that are going to enter wetlands. They're going to outcompete with those native species and deteriorate that habitat quality. And so at the suburban site, we found rusty crayfish and Asian carp. So that's also not really good news for the future of this site, kind of telling us that we do need active management here if we're going to maintain this site in the future. Nice. And then lastly, we want to look at those habitat specialists. So kind of those indicator species that are, if they're not there, that tells us that there's something going wrong. And with fish species, there was 3 of these kind of habitat specialists at the high quality site, but only 1 at that suburban site. So that tells me that there is still hope for this site, but we're seeing an active decline in these numbers of species. Then if we look at amphibians and crayfish, we're not seeing any of these habitat specialists at the suburban site at all. So at the high quality site, we have, so of these species though, the very interesting thing, things like the tiger salamander, the leopard frog, and the digger crayfish, is that they also require upland habitat surrounding that wetland. So this means that the area in the high quality site also has a nice little buffer around that wetland area, but that's been lost at our suburban site. And there's also these primary burrowers at our high quality site, which means that we're having animals that are actively being ecosystem engineers. So kind of maintaining that structural diversity in these wetlands that's going to maintain that really complex food web that's going to support all of these different species. So this is starting to tell us that at that suburban site, there's a lot of issues going on and they need to be addressed, but the wetland seems to be doing all right at this high quality site. So overall, when looking at the difference between these indicator species, we're seeing this really high diversity of indicator species and these habitat specialists at our high quality site. Whereas our suburban site, there is a little bit of diversity, but those invasives and a lot of those generalist species are most of what's holding on there. So we really need a lot more habitat management there. And you might have noticed, I did not talk about turtles because we're going to talk about them more in a second. So I showed a similar picture when we were comparing the difference of those other indicator species between sites. But when you looked at that figure, there was all 3 turtle species that we expected at both of those sites. So comparing just number of species is not telling us anything if we're just looking at turtle species. So if we want to learn more about how these turtles are surviving and thriving, we need to look at other factors about these species. So just to remind you, these turtles live a really long time. They have that delayed sexual maturity, and each different life stage requires that different habitat and has different threats. So it complicates their conservation. Where we're having in lots of these populations, we're seeing this really high adult mortality. So too many adults are dying and reduced juvenile recruitment. So not enough young turtles are making it to adulthood to replace those lost adults. So we're really seeing these huge population declines, but it happens slowly and cyclically year after year after year. So you have to pay more close attention to how many of these groups there are to detect these trends instead of just presence or absence. So to quickly go back about head starting for those of you who don't know, this is one of the strategies besides just habitat restoration and wetland restoration used to conserve Blanding's turtles and other turtle species. And the goal is that we're protecting these really young turtles, so the eggs and the eggs and the hatchlings. So during their most vulnerable life stage, where they're small, their shell isn't very hard, so they're really good prey for a lot of different things. And we keep them in captivity to protect them, but also boost their growth to then release them back out in the wild with the hopes that they'll be bigger and stronger and more able to make it to adulthood. So this involves taking eggs from wild turtles and bringing them into captivity, incubating those eggs. Once they hatch, we will keep them in these little bins and rear them for 1 to 2 years to, again, protect them from all of the bad things that are out in nature and get them bigger and stronger. So then once we release them, they're less likely to be eaten. And these turtles will hopefully make it to adulthood to make that decline kind of halt on that side a little bit. So this is a great strategy that has helped recover a lot of different populations of turtles, but it's just a Band-Aid and it's not something that's going to help these populations sustain themselves over the long term. Sometimes it's necessary to give that population a little boost, but if we don't fix the underlying threats, like habitat, deteriorating habitat, then this isn't going to help. It's just going to be a forever cycle of releasing baby turtles. And this is also a great strategy, but it's very species specific. So this is helping the turtles, but it's not helping all of the other community where these turtles live and what they need to thrive. So the next question I wanted to address was, can we detect those habitat differences looking at that turtle age structure? So at these really suburban sites, are we able to see a actively declining population where we're seeing less and less of each of those age classes over time? So this figure here is showing the number of turtle captured, and these bars are showing pre-2016. So this was when there was a little bit of habitat restoration going on here and things were kind of hanging on. We were seeing a huge number of adult Blanding's turtles. So right here's the adults. So about 25 adults, which is a lot for Blanding's turtles. And then none of this middle age class and a fair amount of those young turtles. But you'll notice that the bar is different for the young turtles. Most of those young turtles were those head starts. So they weren't turtles that were naturally recruited into the population. So if we look at the number of turtles captured after 2016 until present, so 10 years afterwards, we are seeing a steep decline in every single age class, where we're seeing way less adults especially, and even less adults if you don't count those head starts that made it into the reproducing population. So this kind of tells us that the poor upland habitat and lack of connectivity is really impacting their ability to be a self-sustaining population. So we're seeing this really active decline because we have the wetland, but we don't have any of the other habitats surrounding it to sustain them. So I wanted to ask that same question and see if we could look at the difference between two sites instead of over time. So next we're going to look at that high quality wetland, so Viola's wetland, and compare it to the wetland next door where there was no head starting, but they do more ecosystem, whole ecosystem management. So this figure here is showing, right here is the high quality wetland and the different age classes, and then the adjacent wetland and the different age classes. And both of these have really large stable populations. This is, as a turtle biologist, you see this and you say, that's awesome. They're gonna do great and we are doing a great job. We can quit. But again, at the high quality wetland site, so the one where they put a lot of effort into restoring those wetlands, most of the juvenile recruitment there is those head starts we've been putting out into the wild. So there's not any natural recruitment going on like we see in that adjacent site. So there's something about our main study site, Viola's home, that isn't supporting that part of the life cycle. So my next question then was, can we look even deeper into turtle health and adult turtle, female turtle, their movement and reproductive ecology to see if we can answer this question to give us ways to improve this habitat for, again, not only the Blandings turtles, but everything else that's using it. So when we looked at the difference between those adult females and their health between sites, at our high quality site, we were seeing way more ectoparasites, so mostly leeches, which a couple of them are okay. It doesn't really impact them. But when you see huge parasite loads, that can really impact their health overall. So that was very negative. Also, at our high quality site, those reproductive females pre-nesting and during nesting were experiencing really, really high levels of inflammation and dehydration. So again, something during that time is really preventing them from being able to lay eggs successfully and complete that life cycle on their own without our help with a head starting. So overall, the adult females are not doing well at our high quality site where we're putting all of this effort in to taking care of the turtles. So looking even closer, we can see if there's something going on with that nesting ecology that can give us some clues into what we should be doing to improve the habitat for this life stage. So when we look at nesting, we can look at movement of these turtles between the two different sites. So the females at our high quality site were crossing roads twice as much during 1 year as the turtles in that adjacent site. And although those turtles at the adjacent site were moving a little bit more, they were not having to cross roads and had these really nice corridors that they could use to get from wetland to wetland and to their nesting locations. And then if we look at nest site availability, these figures here are just showing, each dot is showing a nest from 1 year of Blandings turtle nest monitoring. And at our high quality site, all the nests are mostly along one line and very, very clumped together. Whereas at the adjacent site, they're spread out and clustered all over the place where they have a lot more room. And this becomes even more clear when you look at what these sites actually look like. So at our high quality site, this railroad track here is where most of our females were nesting. And there's actually a turtle right there laying eggs in the riprap. And you can imagine when those pieces of rock are about this big for a turtle that's this big, that's going to be a very, very difficult task to try to lay eggs there versus our adjacent site. And there's a huge variety of nesting locations that they can choose from. And all of them have this beautiful area where there's a lot of sandy soils that are well drained, not too much vegetation. So really ideal spots for turtles to lay their eggs. So it seems like when you look at these differences, it doesn't really matter. But when you start looking at these individuals and the differences between how long these turtles are surviving, that's when things become really apparent. So Viola had always nested in backyards and was one of the highest, across the highest number of roads to get to her site. So this past summer, we noticed she was not producing eggs, which she had been every year for the last 20 years. She stopped moving, and despite our best efforts, she passed away this summer. And a lot of the necropsy results were suggesting that there was too much inflammation and too much, had some toxins from leaching from nearby suburban areas. So these habitat variables were directly contributing to the ability for some of these turtles to be able to survive and thrive. So she died at 50 years old, which is very, very young for this species, and that loses decades of reproductive potential. So that can be felt throughout that population where you're seeing those effects for years after years and that kind of extinction vortex. But some cool things about Viola, she was our largest female. When she had eggs, she was the largest turtle in the entire population, even bigger than all of the males. We had, after 2 decades of studying her, we had over 500 locations on her. She had the record clutch size, so the largest known clutch size number of eggs for a Blanding's turtle, which was 24. So that makes sense. She was a very, very big lady. And 129 of her offspring were part of that head starting program and were then released back out into that population to help boost it to get back to that level of self-sustaining. She also, the data that we collected from her contributed to over 17 scientific publications about turtle survival, growth, reproductive ecology, movement, habitat use, and health. So every single one of those points helped us learn more, not only about her population, but also the species of Blanding's turtles overall. And then I sat down to try to figure out how many people got to track her and learn how to radio track or practice before they're going off to their next job to become a wildlife biologist. And I got to 70 people and I stopped counting because there are so many people that Viola has impacted and inspired to go into the field of conservation. But not only that, like I said, this early loss, because of all this deteriorating habitat, loses so much reproductive potential that instead of focusing on head starting, making sure that these adults can survive and do what they do best is kind of our utmost priority. So overall, when we're looking at these indicator species, the presence and absence, it can give us a lot of information about habitat health, especially between very degraded areas and less degraded areas. But it's only that snapshot that we're getting when we're just looking at presence and absence. But if we start looking at all the work we've been doing with turtles and comparing that to these different habitat health metrics, it can provide us with some really interesting insights about the ecosystem health as a whole because of their ability to move around in these like large landscapes. And so starting to do restoration for all of the life stages of turtles, not just those specific wetlands, should be a priority and should also help with all of these wetland dependent species as well. So the impacts would go beyond just turtles. So for example, things like wetland restoration and connectivity to uplands will help juvenile recruitment for turtles, but it'll also help all those species like the tiger salamander and the leopard frog that require those uplands as well. And having the buffer restoration is going to improve that female health and juvenile recruitment, but it's also going to help all the species that require the uplands to function with the wetlands. So just to really nail this point home here, that's an umbrella. When we focus our restoration and our conservation efforts with the thought of other species in mind, we can make each conservation action have larger effects than just one species. So using Blanding's turtles as an umbrella species for conservation and conserving these really large habitats that contain several different types of important habitats is going to help all of these great species that thrive in the Midwest. So my kind of take-home message here is that empathy can be okay in science. A lot of times we're told that it's not a good thing to do, that we need to not have biases, and we need to maintain the scientific rigor. But caring about individual animals kind of gives us that fuel to continue these really long-term projects that seem almost insurmountable. And this long-term work on studying turtles, very specifically their demography and their health, can reveal some of these ecosystem flaws that we haven't noticed before and help guide restoration towards a more natural ecosystem function. So this landscape conservation is key, not just looking at one thing at once. And to not leave you on a bad note, 1 month after Viola's passing, we were trapping and we caught this female here. She was a newly adult female. She had eggs. And was going to lay eggs. And she was a former Head Start and was Viola's offspring. So Viola's impact is still being felt in this population. But this also reminded me that not only now do I want to make sure that I'm conserving all these natural areas for my children and their generation, but I also want to make sure that we're conserving them for Viola's offspring and all these other animals that are so important to our natural areas here in the Midwest. So, like I said at the very beginning, all this work was done with several different partners over 20 years and still ongoing. And lots of people who are out there and working hard to catch turtles every single day over the summer. Lots of people with helping funding. So this was not a project that was done alone, and we can't do conservation alone. So thank you to all these people, and thank you to all of you for coming and listening about turtles today.